Thank you for taking an evening to join us to learn about indoor seed starting with the Wood County Master Gardener Volunteer, Donna. Just a few quick things. I believe I saw somebody raise their hand. The hand is back down. If you have a question or a concern, please use the chat or Q&A feature. The chat is really handy for just general-based questions, and the Q&A is really handy to use for questions specifically related to tonight's question or topic, or to gardening in general, questions that are specifically for our presenter, Donna, whereas the other questions might be for the chat, that might be questions regarding technology or just basic things that I can answer while she's speaking. Additionally, we try to answer questions every couple of slides, but sometimes we'll get through a good chunk of them, or we'll be at the end and we'll get back to any of those. So don't hesitate to throw those questions down anytime you think of them. We will refer to them when we have the opportunity as soon as possible. It just might take a little bit of patience. And then if you have further questions, you can follow up then. Looks like I do have one Q&A. She is not exactly a tortie. I had a question about my cat. So she's going to be a part of this for a few moments. This is Bailey. She's not a tortoiseshell. She is a tabby and tortoiseshell mix. So that's your answer. But I think that's enough of me. We're going to hand everything over to Donna so she can go ahead and take over. I am going to be muted and have my camera off so I don't distract in any way, but I will be here. So if you have questions, I will help you, and I will bring them up to Donna if we need to have something taken care of. So take it away, Donna.
All right, welcome to our program tonight. Bethany just made a mention that if you missed the program last month, we talked about selecting seeds and what's involved with selecting seeds. Things you might be looking for when you're looking in seed packets or in a garden catalog. So if you can find that YouTube video that she has from last month, you might want to take a look at that. Our seed starting that we're talking about tonight is for plants that need to be started from seed, because generally they don't have a long enough growing season if you were to plant them in the ground. In the spring. Seed starting indoors is a way to increase the choices you have for different varieties of plants too, and you might be able to choose something that is best suited to your growing conditions, or maybe plants that have a specific quality that you like a certain color of flower or something like that. You have a greater selection if you can start seeds, because many seed catalogs have maybe 40, 50 different kinds of tomatoes, whereas your local garden center may only have a few kinds available as transplants in the spring. Or maybe you want some kind of different flowers from the usual ones that are offered at garden centers. And another reason you might want to start seeds is it saves money, especially if you start many plants of the same kind. A seed packet for $5 or under might have 15 to 500 or sometimes even 1,000 seeds in it, whereas a single plant in a garden center might be $5. Granted that you do have to have some additional expense for some supplies to start seeds, but we will be talking about reducing much of that cost too. Third, many commercial growers use a variety of chemicals to control the growing conditions of the thousands of plants in greenhouses that they grow every year. They might use things for pest and insect control, disease control, growth regulators to either slow down or speed up the rate at which a plant is growing, in order to bring it to market in the condition that people want to see. For example, it has flowers on it when normally that plant would not flower until July. You can avoid all of that by growing your own plants. And lastly, the personal satisfaction you can get from starting your own plants and the opportunity to get your hands in the dirt when we have this cold weather that we're having now, and spring looks like it's a long, long way off. As I said earlier, the seeds that you want to start indoors are those that need a longer growing season. Plants like tomatoes, eggplants, peppers, okra, onions and leeks, broccoli, cabbage, Brussels sprouts, celery, head cabbage, cauliflower, and many flowers also take a longer time to get going than you want to have them take to put them outside in the spring. Some people like to try things like cucumbers and squashes. Although they are warm season vegetables, they generally don't work well for starting indoors. They tend to grow quite rapidly, and they also have very fragile root systems, so they do not transplant very well. When are you going to start your seeds indoors? That all hinges on your average last frost date. For example, if it's May 12th, then you can use charts or the information on the back of your seed packet to know when to start your vegetables. For example, it might say start seeds indoors 6 to 8 weeks before last frost date. Or it might say start plants indoors 10 weeks before planting out in the garden. So you would need to know your last frost date, and that's going to vary by where you live, basically how far north of the equator you are. But then there are some parts of the country that have later or earlier frost dates too, depending on elevation and whether you're close to a large body of water or along the coast of a country. So you need to figure your last frost date. You can get this information by going on a lot of weather sites. They will tell you that. Just Google last frost date map and you'll probably get that information. How long do you want to keep the plants indoors? For example, if you start them in mid-January, you're going to have them around for 16 or 17 weeks in our part of the country. But some plants may need to be started that early. For example, leucanthus and some of the early February flowers might be pansies and violas, so that they'll be out and ready to bloom by the time you want to put them outside. I started some leeks and onions about a week ago, and they're just starting to come up. And I also started some impatiens about a week ago. It's kind of fun to watch these flowers grow. Impatiens you do not cover with any soil when you plant them. And so if you watch after a few days after they're planted, you'll start to see a little green shoot coming out from one end of the seed, and that burrows down into the ground. And then a few days later, you start to see the first leaf. So it's kind of fun to watch them grow. But these are some suggestions for vegetables. There are two handouts that you have in the resources that give you suggestions for starting times for many, many flowers and vegetables. So you want to start them pretty much on this schedule. If you start them too late, of course, they're going to be a little bit too small when you put them outside. And if you start them too early, you're going to have plants that are too big. And many times they get very tall and willowy, and they tend to break off more easily than when you put them outside. So starting the timing, you have to be kind of careful about when you start them. You just don't go and start everything all at one time. For example, I started some celery, but I probably won't start tomatoes until around early April because they grow much faster. What do you need to do seed starting indoors? Of course, you need seeds. You'll need some kind of containers and a tray to put them on, because the containers need to have holes in the bottom for drainage. You'll need something to be able to label the seeds when you plant them, a seed starting mix, access to light, and some heat is helpful for starting the seedlings at the very beginning. So let's take a look at some other things. Newspaper or plastic to protect a work area if you haven't got an area, say like a basement, where you don't really care too much if you get a little dirt here and there. You're going to need a water source nearby or a clean container of water. And it's going to take quite a bit of water because you need to wet the potting mix before you start. A pencil or a dowel for making planting indentations. A spray water bottle really helps to keep the soil moist when they're starting without washing the seeds away. A marker or pen to record what was planted, and a piece of paper or some kind of labels, plant labels, plastic wrap, plastic sheeting, a humidity dome or a pane of glass, and later on a fan. So we'll go through how each one of these things are used. If you haven't already ordered your seeds, I would do so quite soon. And if they're starting to show up in the stores, I haven't been in a store for quite a while due to COVID, but if they're starting to show up in stores, I would do your shopping earlier rather than later. Last year, there was quite a shortage on all things having to do with gardens, from seeds to soil to implements to just canning jars, canning lids. So plan to order early if you haven't already done so. Read the descriptions of the seeds if you're buying them in a store. Look at the back of the package and read the description to see if that's really the plant that you want, if that's going to fit in your garden where you want to plant it. Or in seed catalogs, they have many descriptions also, probably in much greater depth than just the seed packets you find in the store. A few seeds may need to be pre-treated. So look at the package when you first buy it and note whether it says it has to be pre-treated. And those are some things like possibly chilling it well, chilling is probably the most common one. Once you get your seeds home, keep them in a cool, dry place, a closed jar in your refrigerator, or even a closed jar in your basement. And keeping them cool and dry will help to preserve the seeds and make more of them sprout. Many seeds can be kept for several years. So if you don't use all of the seeds this year and you can't share them with friends or no one else wants to use them this year, you can still keep them for several years. And we'll talk about that later. So you need to store them correctly if you're going to keep them from one year to the next, which basically means a cool, dry place. A seed packet has a lot of information on it. You will have if you notice, I don't know if you can see my pointer, this says this packet needs full sun, which full sun is described as at least 6 hours of sun. More than 6, up to 8 or 12 is always better. The days to maturity, so it tells you how long it's going to take before you can harvest these beans. The planting depth, and this one has a little picture, sometimes it's in words. So this one should be planted an inch deep. Thin the plants to 6 inches apart once they start growing. If you're going to grow it in a container, it says to put 5 plants in a 12-inch container. And many of the seed packets now are also talking about square foot gardening, which we will cover in April, what that means and how to plant for square foot gardening. And there might be additional tips. Like it might say you might want to put mulch on it, or there are it might need to be staked, have something to grow on. So look at the information on the back of the seed packet. Containers, they have to be large enough for the plant, or as big as the plant is going to get before you plant it outside. So generally, if you're planting like tomatoes and peppers, you're going to need eventually a pot that's probably about 3 inches across, whether that's square or round. Some things do not need as big a container, like onions, but kind of take a look at what you think the plant is going to need before it's ready to be planted out. It also has to be sturdy enough to last. You can make containers out of paper, rolled paper tubes and that sort of thing. They're not quite as sturdy as some other containers, but if you use enough layers, it'll probably work. All containers must have drainage holes in the bottom. Otherwise, your plants are going to drown. Their roots will get too wet and they'll rot and your plants will die. So you have two ways of looking at how you're going to do containers. You can start with a smaller container and transplant the little plant into a larger container, or you can start with a bigger container to begin with, and then you won't have to transplant. The major reason you might not want to start with a bigger container is you might not have a good starting place for that many pots of that size. The containers must be clean and sterile if you're reusing. So if you've saved some pots from plants you got at a garden center from previous years, they have to be sterilized before you use them, because they could be carrying disease and organisms. What you do then is you clean them with soap and water, rinse them, and soak them in a solution of 10% bleach and 90% water. So it's a 1:9 ratio. And you can soak them for about 30 minutes and then rinse them and dry them, and they'll be ready to go. You're going to need a tray underneath those pots because they're going to be having water coming out of the bottom as the moisture drains. So you'll want to have something to put those pots on so it doesn't get wet all over wherever you've got your plants sitting. Here are some examples of things you can use to start plants. In the upper left corner, these are you might see them Jiffy pellets or by some other similar name. And what they are is a condensed little pellet. You soak it in water and it expands. These are good for starting seeds. They're kind of hard to label. And also you want to note whether the outside coating there is papery or if it's actually like plasticky. Because you want the roots to be able to go through. So a paper covering is probably better. In the lower right corner, you have peat pots, and these you can plant right out in the garden. You should score the sides or cut slits in the sides so the roots come through when you plant them out, but you don't have to transplant then, or you don't have to take it out of the pot and then have the pots left over when you're finished. Above that, you see the typical plastic seedling pot, and these are often sold in trays with a certain number of them in a tray, anything from a 1-inch square pot all the way to a 3-inch square pot in a tray. In the lower left, you see a growing system. And some companies sell these. They are handy to use, but they're hard to reuse, and therefore they're quite pricey if you're going to replace them every year. But what this does is the bottom part here, the bottom white part, is a reservoir of water, and it has a piece of felted cloth that hangs into that reservoir of water. The water wicks up that felted cloth and waters the plants from the bottom, because the top white container here is a series of holes through that styrofoam. And so you fill the soil into the hole, but the bottom is open so the water can go through there. And then it's got a humidity dome on it. That's the clear cover there that you can use when you start the seeds to keep the soil moist while the seeds are germinating. These are reusable, but I've tried them. They're a bugger to clean up and try to sanitize for a following year. Although if you're just starting a small number of plants and you have the money to spend, it's a very convenient way to do it. In the middle, on the bottom, you see what's called a soil block maker. And it's a gadget where you moisten the soil and then you push down on that metal thing. You have your hand on the top of the curve on the top, and then when you get the bottom blocks down here, this is a 4-block one. When you get those full of soil, by pressing down in the soil, you lift that out, you put it down on a tray, and then you push down on the handle and lift up on the bar, and it releases those blocks. You can see that you can get different sizes. The hand is holding a very, very tiny one here that would be used to start maybe some very tiny flower seeds. And then that block can be inserted into a larger block, so it really makes transplanting easy. When you're done, you just plant the whole block, the whole soil block into the garden. I prefer this method because when I'm done, I don't have any pots to wash up. I don't have any pots to throw away. The soil maker itself is maybe $30, but you reuse it over and over and over again. So that's another option that you might want to use. But then those are all things you have to buy. There are a lot of things you can buy that are free, or a lot of things that you can do that are free. I'm trying to get my picture out of the corner up there. I don't know if you can see that or not. You can start with even things like takeout containers, egg shells, or the egg cartons, as you can see down here. And in this case, they're using the top of the egg carton as a tray underneath the bottom part, because you have to put holes in the bottom and to catch the water. So it's kind of a self-contained system. Another favorite of mine, if I do not have peat pots or something else when I'm going to give away plants maybe, is yogurt cups or other small plastic containers about this size. Up here on top, I talked about making paper pots, taking strips of newspaper, rolling them around, say, a jar or a glass, and folding in the bottom. You don't have to worry about holes in the bottom of these because the water will soak through the paper on the bottom. These are a little bit more fragile. You have to be a little bit more careful when you're planting those. And in the bottom, some people started in a flat, it's called, and you just make a row, sort of like a furrow, like you would do with a hoe in the garden, and you plant your seeds, and then you mark the seeds, different kinds of seeds that you've got planted in here. In this case, once they sprout and start growing and have about 2 sets of leaves, you'll have to transplant all those little plants into separate pots. Basically, you'll have to do that also with the egg carton here and this egg setup here too. Some other things that people have used are cut paper towel or toilet paper rolls, you know, the roll that's left when you're done with the paper towels. Plastic or styrofoam cups also work as long as you punch holes in the bottom. So those are some things that you can use that will cut down the cost of starting seeds indoors rather than having to buy something to get started. Okay, plant labels. Again, you can buy plant labels. You can use things like popsicle sticks, old blind slats. I've got a picture here of a dairy container cut into strips, and that plastic will hold up, and then you write the name of your plant on there with a permanent marker. You can mark on the pot if you have, say you have white plastic pots or something, you can mark right on the pot what's inside of it. Or you can put tape on a pot and then mark on the tape what's inside the plant or the pot. So depending on what you use for potting or growing the plants, you can adapt your labeling system to that. It's really, really, really important to label it, because if you've got 3 kinds of tomatoes, they all look alike when they first start growing and you won't know which is which. So if you're growing any more than 1 kind of a plant, you need to label it. Okay, what are you going to grow it in? You need to use a seed starting mix, and this is different than potting soil. It's a much lighter mixture. It's usually made of perlite, vermiculite, milled peat moss, or coconut coir. It holds water well because of the peat moss or the coconut coir, but it also is light and airy because of the perlite and the vermiculite. There should be little or no fertilizer in it, and none of those water holding crystals like you get the Moisture Plus or Moisture Control potting mix. You don't want that. It does not contain any garden soil, and don't start with garden soil either. That's much too heavy, and you're going to be bringing in the possibility of lots of disease. It's free of weed seeds usually. It's less likely to transfer plant diseases. And you can either make your own by buying these ingredients and mixing them about equal parts, or you can buy a pre-made package. What kind of light will you need? Window light is usually really not enough to grow plants in the wintertime. It's often also too cold near a window. This last cold snap, I froze one of my pothos vines. It was on the windowsill, and the cold air was coming down underneath the blinds and just froze the whole vine. So it's a warning to you if you're starting seeds on or trying to grow anything on windowsills. Some type of artificial light is usually needed. It can be a fluorescent light or an LED, preferably not incandescent bulbs. They get too warm because they have to be pretty close to the plants. It should contain a full spectrum. Grow lights have full spectrum lights, which means it has the red and the blue, or you can have one warm and one cool bulb in a fixture, and adjustable as the plant lights, as the plants grow. So they're going to get taller, so you're going to have to adjust the height of the lights also. Probably the easiest thing is a shop light setup of some kind with one cool and one warm bulb. Suspended maybe on chains or something. Some people suspend them from like the ceiling in their basement if they have a basement. Or rig up some other thing where you can adjust the height of the lights as the plants grow. Heat sources. Heat helps to speed germination. The plants will usually germinate on their own. It'll just take a little bit longer if you don't have a heat source, so I wouldn't get real concerned about this. Some people put them on top of a refrigerator or over a place where a heat register comes out, near a furnace, maybe in the basement. You want it to be away from drafts and away from windows, though, where you start these. What you see in the picture is called a seedling heat mat. It's a kind of a rubberized mat that heats just a few degrees warmer than the air around. So it's helpful if you're starting the seeds in a cooler place. Do not, under any circumstances, use any people heating pads or any of those kinds of things. They'll get much too warm and you'll cook the plants. They're also not made to be gotten wet, and your seedling mat could get wet because you're going to have moist plants sitting on it, and if anything leaks, it's going to get wet. So the heat seedling mat, they're not very expensive. They last quite a long time, but if you don't want to spend money on that, you don't have to. So that's just something to do. Okay, now how do we do it? Like we say, choose an area where you can get a little bit dirty, or else put something down. You're going to grab probably a bucket of water, depending on how many you're going to start. You need some kind of a large container to use to wet the mix. Either a clean pail or an old dish pan works really well. You need to get the mix wet before you start planting. If you put the seeds in and then try to wet it, it's kind of like resists the water, and you're not going to get the container thoroughly wet. It also sometimes floats around on top of the water and might take your seeds with it. It also sometimes packs down a little bit when it gets wet, so you only have a half a container full once it's really wet. So make sure you wet the mix before you start planting anything. You want it to be wet enough that it holds together when you squeeze it, but you should not get any water dripping out when you're squeezing it. Fill the containers to near the top and pat it down gently. You don't want to pack it down too tightly because that makes it too dense for the little roots to start growing. So just kind of pat it down, level it off. And after you've got your containers filled, if you're using a large undivided container, you can make those rows. Remember, we saw those little furrows that they had planted the seeds in. About 2 inches apart. You can do that by pressing a pencil or a dowel into the top of the mix until you get it down to the appropriate depth. If you're using individual containers, you can use a pencil tip to make a hole to the appropriate depth for planting. And you place the seeds in the row, maybe half an inch to an inch apart. Or if you're doing individual containers or individual planting cells, 1 to 2 seeds per individual container. The back of the seed packet will tell you whether the seeds need to be covered or not. If they need to be covered, you can sprinkle a little vermiculite or a mix over the seeds. If they are planted like 1 inch deep, you can just close the hole over the seed and pat it down. If seeds need light to germinate, if it says that, do not cover. Light is needed for germination. Do not add any more mix on top. In any case, tamp the soil lightly to make the seed good seed and soil contact. So even if the seeds are on top of the soil, just tap it lightly with your finger to push the seeds down so it's really touching or in good contact with the soil. And then mist the surface until it's thoroughly wet. And that's where, especially if you're not covering the seed, that's where the spray bottle works better than just trying to pour some water in it and wash the seeds away. Be sure you label the rows or individual pots as you plant so that you don't get any seeds mixed up and you say, well, I don't think I planted 6 of those. I thought I planted 6 of something else, but that's what you did if you don't label it. If you're going to store seeds, keep the seed packet, even if it's empty, because it has more information on it often that tells you other things to do during the growing season. So don't throw it away. Keep it until at least the end of the growing season. You can also make notes on that seed packet as the season progresses, and then you can decide if that's something you want to plant again next year or not. If you're going to keep seeds, place it in a sealed container. A jar with a lid that screws on tight is a good thing. You can also, well, that's probably the best, a glass or a plastic jar with a really tight screw-on cover. You can also put it like in a Ziploc bag, but those sometimes develop holes and cracks. Add a desiccant, which is something to keep it dry, like you find those little packets inside shoe boxes when you open your shoe box. You can buy desiccant, and again, you don't have to buy it. You can also put about a tablespoon of dry powdered milk in a piece of paper toweling and fold up the sides, put a rubber band around the top and throw that in the container. That acts as a desiccant to keep the moisture down. You want to store it in a cool place then. Basements are pretty much ideal as long as the container is tightly closed in case your basement's a little bit damp in the summertime. The storage length varies. Onions and corn sometimes grow the second year okay, but those are two that don't keep as well. Some plants, I think I planted some broccoli seeds last year that were about 9 years old, and because it was a favorite kind and I haven't been able to get it since I got that packet, and so it still grew. So that if you're not sure next year if the seeds are good, you can do what's called a germination test. You take 10 seeds, put them in a wet paper towel, and it's inside a plastic bag, and then leave that in a warm place for a few days. And then you count how many seeds sprout. If only one sprouts, they're probably not very good. It means only 1 seed out of 10 is probably going to grow for you. If 9 out of 10 sprout, you know that the seeds are pretty good and most of them will sprout the following year. If you get down to about 50%, you have a choice. You can just sow the seeds thicker. And so instead of sowing them 1 inch apart, you sow them a half an inch apart and hope every other one comes up. Or you can opt for new seeds. But that's the way you can tell how good your seeds are the following year. Now you're going to get ready to wait for the seeds to germinate. And until the seeds do germinate, which means they start to show up out of the ground, you need to keep the pots covered to prevent drying out, because the best way to not have a good successful seed starting is to allow the seeds to get wet, start to germinate, and then they dry up and they're done. So you need to keep it covered to prevent it from drying out. You can do that with put them inside a plastic bag, put plastic wrap over the top, put a glass pane over the top, get one of those fancy humidity domes if you want to, but you just need to keep it from drying out. Check it every day, mist it a little bit if the soil seems like it's not real wet. Place it in a warm place or on a heat mat. Keep it in a lighted area if light is needed for germination. Check daily to see whether anything's sprouting or not. And the germination time will depend on the temperature and the particular seed that you're using. Some plants germinate in 2, 3, 4 days. Some plants maybe take as long as 21 days. So again, if your seed packet tells you how long till the plants germinate, that gives you a good idea of whether or not the seeds are going to germinate eventually, or did none of them not germinate. For example, if it says germination is 7 to 10 days and you've been watching for like 3 weeks and you haven't seen anything, they're probably not going to germinate anymore. So once they start to germinate, when you see little sprouts showing up, remove the plastic covering when about 50% of them are visible. Remove it from the heat source, because once plants start to grow, they don't need that heat anymore. And then place it in a brightly lit area for 12 to 16 hours a day. Room temperature or slightly cooler is good. Either room temperature in a normal home or basement. Growing them in a basement works really well. Monitor the watering, not too much, not too little. The top of the soil should be a little damp, but not soggy. And if possible, water from the bottom, but don't let the plants sit in water. So if you pour some water into the bottom of a tray where you have a bunch of pots and you come back 15 minutes later and there's still water sitting there, you need to pour that out. When you get 1 or 2 sets of true leaves, you need to either thin the plants if you planted more than 1 seed in a pot, or transplant if you planted, say, a whole bunch of seeds in a smaller pot. If you're going to just thin by cutting the stems of the unwanted plants. You don't pull them out, because if you pull them out, you'll probably disturb the roots of the plants nearby. So thin them by cutting off the stem right at the soil line. The first leaves that you'll see are not actually leaves. They're called cotyledons, and they are what we call seed leaves. They're often part of the seed itself, and those are the 2 leaves that first emerge, and they're getting their food yet from the seed that you planted. Soon after that, it will grow 2 leaves that actually look like the leaves of the plant. The cotyledons very often look very different than the leaves of the plants. So don't panic if you planted tomato plants and the first things that come up look like grass seeds or something like that, because the cotyledons look very different. When you're transplanting, use a dull knife or a popsicle stick to gently separate the plants. Support the root ball with a spoon or a fork or a popsicle stick. as you're transferring the seedling from the starting pot to the transplanting pot. Hold the seedlings by the leaves, not by the stem. If you happen to tear a leaf, the plant can grow a new leaf. If you happen to tear the stem or break the stem, the plant is pretty much done. So you're going to place the little seedlings into separate pots filled with, again, pre-moistened mix. You want to have the mix wet before you start putting the transplants in it. And add enough mix to fill the pot and gently firm it around the plant to support the stem. Water it well, usually until the water starts coming out the bottom, and then put it in a tray or wherever else you're going to start continuing to grow it on. If you water it down and the plants, the soil goes down a little bit, you can add some more in the pot. Okay, now you got them transplanted and we want to keep them growing now. And so bottom watering is best. If you water from the top, avoid getting the leaves wet. So don't just sprinkle everything from the top and let all the leaves be wet. And never let the pot sit in water. That goes for any plant you have planted anywhere, whether it's inside or outside. Keep a light source within 1 inch or 3 of the plant top and raise the light or lower the plants as needed. Check daily. Once the plants get going, you'll be surprised how much they grow in a day. Allow the soil surface to just begin to dry before watering, and actually test the soil before watering. Stick your finger in or a popsicle stick or something just to see if it's wet below the surface. You don't really need to water it if it's wet below the surface, even though the surface is dry. When the plants have several sets of true leaves, you can start adding a little bit of fertilizer. Let's see. Some things that might happen to seedlings. Your plants are growing along really good and all of a sudden the plant like collapses, like the stem just like gets real soft and just folds over. This is a disease called damping off, and it's caused by too much moisture, humidity, or overwatering. It's also caused by poor air circulation because that added moisture is just sitting around the plant, and that's makes a really good condition for the fungus that causes that damping off to grow. Poor drainage, your plants might be sitting in water. Using a potting mix or soil instead of using a seed starting mix. And it may also come from dirty containers too. So another thing is yellowing of the leaves. That's generally 2 things. One is either a nutrient deficiency, so you need to start fertilizing a little bit. So check to see if the seed starting mix you started with had any fertilizer in it or not. And again, overcrowding of seedlings, if you didn't thin them, means they're competing for nutrients, so they're not getting enough. The second thing that will cause leaves to turn yellow is excessive watering. And in this case, you're watering so much that the roots are rotting and therefore the plants can't take up nutrients and water, and so they're turning yellow and dying. Fertilizer burn also might cause this if you damage the roots by applying too much fertilizer. So if you're going to fertilize, start with like 1/4 strength. So if they say 3 tablespoons or 3 teaspoons or a tablespoon to a gallon of water, you're going to want to do like 3/4 of a teaspoon to a gallon of water and start with that. Some other things that might cause yellowing are not enough light, or the light source is too far from your seedlings, or the temperatures might be too high too. If the leaf edges curl under, or there's like stunted or slow growth, your plants could actually have too much light. They need a rest period every day. So 16 hours a day of light is maximum that you wanted to give the plants. Again, it could be over fertilizing, not warm enough for the plants. You might be trying to grow them at 50 degrees, and that's not real good temperature for any plants. Again, excessive moisture, so don't overwater. If you find moss or mold growing on the surface, this generally means there's a lack of air circulation. Set up a fan close to where your plants are so the air moves around. You're watering too much also because the soil is remaining consistently too wet. So be sure to test the moisture before you water again. And if you're getting real tall, spindly plants, generally they're not getting enough light. They're too far from the light source, or they're too crowded and they're competing for the light. So you might need to move the pots away from each other a little bit so each plant has a little bit more personal space. Now, if you're going to be eventually planting these outside, of course, you're going to need to harden off the plants before you plant them outside. This is because your plants have been growing indoors. They are used to bright light, but not bright as the sun. They're not used to having wind. They're not used to having any of the other harsher conditions outside, the variation in temperatures. So while they're indoors yet, you start this probably maybe 2 weeks before you're going to start hardening them off. And you gradually increase the time between watering. So allow the soil to get a little bit drier than usual. And then starting about 2 weeks before you want to put them outside, you begin by toughening up the plants. You would set them out on a warm day in a place where they're in the shade and out of the wind for a few hours, and bring them in at night. The next day you expose them to more time outside and bring them in if it's going to get cool. And gradually over a week or two, you gradually increase the sun and the wind exposure. And once your plants are hard enough, they can then remain outside unless you're going to have a frost that might kill them. So it is a bit of a work to do this hardening off process. Some people put them out and maybe just cover them at night, which would be another alternative. And again, you want to put them in a place where if you have critters, the critters are not going to have access to them, especially at night. I'm going to tell you about another way of sowing. If this all sounds really, really complicated to you, I'm going to talk about winter sowing, and this is Mother Nature's way of growing plants. So what you need for this are generally seeds that are perennials. So, I mean, if you're growing something that comes back year after year, you can take seeds from that plant. Also, any seeds that self-seed from one year to the next would be good candidates for this. Any vegetables that are cool season vegetables also work really well. And the reason that it works is because all the seeds, especially of perennials, need a process called stratification before they will sprout. And this is Mother Nature's way of saying, okay, if I drop the seed in the fall and it gets moisture and it gets light and the ground is still warm, that seed will start growing, except it's going to get killed as soon as the frost comes. So Mother Nature has said, okay, I'm going to make sure that it's not going to sprout in the fall. So it's going to have moisture, and it's going to have a chilling period. So it's not going to start growing right away. It's going to have to freeze and thaw a couple times, and then it will know that it's time to start growing, because then it'll be spring. And so that's what stratification does for perennial seeds. And winter sowing is a way of doing that. When I first talked about some seeds needing to be pre-treated, this is what that process would be. And generally they tell you to put the seeds in moist peat moss in your refrigerator for anywhere from maybe 2 to 8 weeks. And this is what you're trying to do when you do that pre-treatment. A few seeds need something called scarification. They have a really, really hard seed coat, and scarification is nicking that seed coat or using a file on it just to kind of break down the seed coat before that seed will sprout. Advantages of winter sowing. You don't have room for them in your house indoors, so you put them outside. You don't need plant lights. You don't have so much mess. You don't have the plants in the house. You don't have electricity for lights, heat mats. You don't have to worry about tending the seedlings, see if they need water every day, adjusting the light. You don't have to harden them off. And the seeds are protected from outside dangers. So if it was a normal seed and it just dropped in the ground, there's any number of things that could happen to it. It could get eaten by something. It could get washed away. It could get buried so deep over the winter or by leaves and things falling on it that it never sprouts. So what you're doing is actually providing a safe place for these seeds to sprout on their own outside. So what do you need? These are some clues of plants that can be grown outside. Perennials that are hardy in your zone, and we're in zone 4 here, so you could do plants in zones 2, 3, and 4. Self-seeding annuals, native plants. Most native plants, you don't go out and plant all those seeds. They come up by themselves. And cool season vegetables. Clues about plants, if you're looking at them, it might say sow in early spring. It might say the plant is hardy, sow in early autumn, withstands frost. If it has weed in the title, or if they're wildflowers, or if the cultivar comes from Siberia, Canada, Alpine, those are also all names that indicate that these plants survive winters. You can see on the right, that's basically your setup for winter sowing, and we'll talk about it in a little more detail. You need clear or translucent plastic containers. Avoid green ones, though. Green is not a good color for growing vegetables or plants. Some duct tape, a utility knife or scissors, some seed starting mix, something to poke holes in the bottom of the containers, and some labels. So containers, generally the things that work best are gallon milk jugs or things of similar size, jugs that contain juice or that sort of thing. You can also use, in the upper right here, you can also use other plastic containers. They need to be tall enough for the plants to have some room to grow inside. You can use the white jugs as long as you can see light through them. You can use wider mouth containers, and I'll talk about what to do about that wider mouth in a minute, but you want to avoid the green ones. Those don't work so good. So what do? First of all, you make some holes in the bottom for drainage, holes or slits. You can either cut slits or holes. You see here slits they're cutting. Some people say cut them up the side a little bit too in case the ones on the bottom get plugged up. After you've done that, you want to do that first because the carton or the jug is more stable before you cut it in half in order to do this poking and slitting. Then you draw a line around the container and you cut on that line all except for a hinge. Leave a little bit of space. Now they cut under the handle. I like to leave the hinge under the handle when I do this. If you're using a plastic container that has a solid cover like down here, you're going to need to poke some holes in the cover too, because you have to have some place for some moisture to get in. If you're using a wide mouth container, like in the lower left here, you can cut and put in a plastic window so that the light can get in. And also we'll have to have some holes in that plastic cover. Then you start with moistened seed starting mix again, and you want to fill the container to about 3 inches and level it off and tamp it down a little bit, just like you would when you're starting other seeds. Sow the seeds fairly thin, depending on your future plant size. Cover to the recommended planting depth. So if it says cover with 1/4 inch of soil or plant 1/4 of an inch deep, then you need to add 1/4 of an inch of soil over the seeds And again, mist it with water. Make sure that your potting mix in there, or your soil seed starting mix, is really good and wet. Then what you do, you can label the container with a paint marker, a permanent marker. Somebody said you can get a cattle marker at Fleet Farm. I'm not sure exactly what that is, but that worked really well. You can also put inside the jug a plastic or a wood plant label that's labeled in pencil, ink, or marker. Or you see here, this person has used a numbering system. So somewhere they're keeping track. The plants growing in this container are number 11, and those might be pansies or something. And then number 8 might be broccoli. So somewhere you've got a list of what's growing in each container. Then you seal the container all the way around with duct tape so that the top and the bottom is taped together. You set it outside in a sunny spot. You don't want to have it up against a building or under eaves because it has to be able to get snow and rain. It's also a little bit too warm sometimes right against a building. You should see moisture on the inside of the container on sunny days in the wintertime, even if it's if you don't see that mist through the opening on the top. You might want to group together tall, narrow containers or place them in a tub so they don't tip over and blow away. Someone also suggested that you run a rope or a wire through all the handles so that if you get a big wind, they don't all take off. You allow the snow and rain to fall because you leave the covers off when you do this. Throw the covers away. And when the snow begins to melt, then you start looking for germination to see if anything's growing. As the weather warms in the spring, you can vent the pot by tipping the top back if it's going to get too warm, because remember, this is a kind of a closed container except for that little hole on the top. And it may need extra water at this point, may need some fertilizer also at this point, just like other seedlings. You can thin what's in there by cutting off some of the extra seedlings, or you can plant them into the garden when the soil is workable. Now, because they're outside, you don't have to do all that hardening off stuff. They're already hardened off. And you can see a picture on the right here of a plant inside that jar, just having a good old time. Some people have tried doing tomatoes and say you can do them, but you have to be very, it's much like hardening off in reverse. You have to be willing to watch the temperature, and if it's going to get cold, once the plants sprout, you have to cover them. I don't know if I would suggest doing any warm season things like tomatoes. Peppers for sure not. Those you would still want to do inside. But for perennials and cold hardy vegetables, this is an easy way to do it. And I'm just going to close like I always do. If you want to find accurate, reliable information when you're researching a problem, search your problem and add the word extension. So for example, when I prepared this talk, I did seed starting extension and came up with a number of resources that I could use that I know have been tested and researched, and they'll work. If you just put in seed starting and you're going to come up with probably 1,000 hits, and a lot of those could just be people who are blogging, who think they know a lot about something, but they really don't. You could get some really bad information because someone says, oh, this worked for me. And by quirk, it might have worked for them one time, but it won't work for you because you live in a different place under different conditions. So go for your extension publications first. And many of the ones that I've listed as resources in the accompanying handout are from extension sources. So do we have any questions? I'm going to click on the question and answer up here. Do you set your homemade blocks in a regular tray? Yeah, just like you would any other types of containers. let's see. Let's see, what labels last over winter? I would use definitely a permanent marker and put the label inside the jug so it'll get less weathering at that point. And like I said, somebody just told me recently that a cattle marker, it's called, evidently you get them at Fleet Farm or wherever cattle products are sold. I'm not sure what it is, but it's some kind of a heavy duty marker, I guess. Do plants need a grow light? You don't need the heat mat. You probably do need some kind of supplemental lighting though. Otherwise your plants are going to get really tall and spindly. So other questions, anybody? I would ask if you have any other suggestions for topics that you want to hear about. Put them in the chat or in the Q&A. And next month, somebody asked about native plants. That's the topic for next month. Another Master Gardener volunteer is going to be doing that one. And I'll be back in April where we actually talk about planting your garden outside. So can you grow gazania by seed? I would think so. If you can find the seed, you can probably grow it by seed. I have not grown that. And I don't know how long before you have to start it, how long before you want the plants to be blooming. Any other questions?
We'll give it a moment or so here, but just a final chance and opportunity to thank everybody for joining us this evening. And I am not seeing any more popping up here. So
Mealy bugs. Off the top of my head, are these inside plants on the inside or outside? Chris, can you tell me if it's inside or outside? Inside, okay. Again, go on Google mealybug control extension. There are a couple different controls that you can use inside, and I'm not off the top of my head sure which one is for mealybugs and which one is for scale. So I don't want to tell you the wrong one, but Google that and you'll probably find your answer.
I accidentally clicked that we answered this, but Kelly asked, I apologize if I missed this, but something like artichokes, can those be planted in Wisconsin?
They can. It's a little bit tricky. You have to start them ahead. So you have a pretty long growing season. But I've heard of people doing it.
All right, I think that is going to be it. It's usually when I say this that another question pops in, but I think we're going to call it good. Thank you everyone for joining us. If you're still here, thank you. Have a great evening. Try to stay warm out there. Maybe we'll see you for next month's program. Please make sure you check it out and register if you haven't already. Thank you. Bye.
Bye-bye.